So I want to thank you for choosing to spend some of your Saturday afternoon with us. My name is Meredith, and I'm a member of Freedom Road, and I'm also a member of the Anti-War Committee, and I'm really excited to be your MC this afternoon. We have a panel of distinguished experts who are very excited to talk to you about rising militarism, declining empire, U.S. foreign policy under Trump. And we're going to be traveling across the globe here today talking about Trump's foreign policy in places like Palestine, the broader Middle East, Russia and Ukraine, the U.S. border, Africa, and China. And in many ways, this is like a mile wide and an inch deep. And so we're going to be covering a lot of different places around the world, but we're also hoping that Q&A is a time where you could, for example, dive more deeply into any of these topics that you're particularly interested in. So this panel today is organized by the Anti-Intervention Unit of the Minnesota Freedom Road District. And we have a couple of objectives today for why we're organizing this event. First, we wanted to introduce our politics to organizers who've joined the movement in the past 3 years. We have had a really great surge of activism that has happened in response to defending the people of Palestine and demanding an end to U.S. military to Israel. And we really wanted to introduce us as Freedom Road to members of that movement beyond just what we have to say about the Middle East. We also wanted to introduce our politics to organizers who are part of this broader anti-Trump movement. We've really seen in the past year a lot of people come out to say no to Trump, but most of those anti-Trump protests are very focused on domestic policies and not on foreign policy. And so we felt like this would be an opportunity to be able to introduce ourselves in that way. And then lastly, something that I think is really important is that we have a lot of people right now in our movement who are very focused on Palestine, but we really think it's important for people to be broader and be anti-imperialist in general, as opposed to just against U.S. sending weapons and arms and financial support and diplomatic support to Israel. And so we really want to use this as an opportunity to try to introduce broader anti-imperialist politics to our community. And so we're really excited that you're here, and we hope that you will find our speakers interesting, and that if there are things that you agree with or disagree with, that not cross-examination. That was like such a slip up from my day job where I coach students how to debate. My bad. We're hoping that questioning and Q&A, not cross-examination, will be an opportunity where we could sort of explore those politics. Okay, that being said, our first speaker we're really excited to welcome is Nadiyah Salwadeh, who is with USPCN. USPCN, this is a newer group here in the Twin Cities, but not a newer group in terms of the United States. US Palestinian Community Network is an important organization that leads the national liberation movement for Palestine here in our own communities, and we're very excited to have Nadiyah here. So please welcome Nadiyah. And Nadiyah is going to choose to speak from the table, and so our other speakers, if you would like to speak at the table, you can, or you could speak at the podium. We are ready for you either way.
Hey guys, thanks. Yeah, I prefer the table. I don't really know why, but yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about foreign imperialism, like under Trump, but I want to kind of rewind to Trump 1 and Biden because that really set the stage for where we're at now. So you can go to the next, and then another one. Gorgeous. So I had, anyways, so cool. Thank you for the opportunity to use all the memes in my phone. I think one of the biggest things under Trump 1 was the Abraham Accords in 2020, which normalized the relationship between Morocco, Sudan, Bahrain, and the UAE with the state of Israel in exchange for not annexing the West Bank, which creates stability for Israel in the region. Obviously, that didn't work because they've been annexing the West Bank. So time has shown how dumb it is to expect normalization to create more peace in the region. And what's more about the Abraham Accords is that it fully left Palestinians out of the conversation about Palestine. And the path that we were led down by the Abraham Accords creates legitimation of the entity of Israel, and it stands in opposition to the right of return, refugee status for Palestinians. And Biden was not innocent in the conversation about the Abraham Accords. He really supported them. So this wasn't just a like Trump doing weird stuff thing. Like Biden really took this on and continued with it. I think another really big thing under Trump was him moving, Trump 1 was him moving the US Embassy to Jerusalem, which killed like any naive, lingering hope, whatever that was, for a two-state solution. And Biden paid lip service to it being a bad move, but he didn't switch it back. So he should have just not said anything. And then another big thing was the defunding of UNRWA. Under Trump, the first term, and then under Biden after allegations of UNRWA involvement in October 7th. So essentially, the legacy of Trump 1 and Biden was to spend their time undermining Palestinian self-determination through normalization, spent their time stripping any last vestiges of pretense the two-state solution would be possible, put their effort into isolating, sanctioning, and cooing Palestinian allies in the region, and defunding UNRWA on multiple occasions, and the acceleration of the genocide following October 7th. So they did a lot of horrible things that led us to where we are now. So I think you can go to the next slide. Yeah, so I don't really want to overstate how much Trump just like says stuff to make him look good, because I think that makes us like overlook the fact that he like also like does bad things. But he does just say stuff to make himself look good. And I think a really good example of that was when he ran on the idea of being an anti-war president, which is like... yeah, that's crazy. So he was on this like America First, called himself a peacemaker in his inauguration speech. And then he goes ahead and says that he's the candidate of those who want to defend Western civilization, defend Israel, and defend the United States of America. When I return to the White House, we will quickly restore stability in the Middle East, and we will return the world to peace. So apart from being like really racist, you should read Edward Said. He also like is pretending that he's going to restore peace to the Middle East, and as we'll talk about later, and like Wyatt will talk about, he like definitely bombed places in the Middle East. So a big part of this peacemaker show was working with the lame duck Biden administration for the January ceasefire that was broken on multiple occasions by Israel and completely fell apart in March of 2025. I think you can go to the next slide. Yeah, cool. So, if you don't remember, that ceasefire deal was supposed to be in 3 phases. It fell apart in phase 1, but essentially phase 1 talked about like allowing aid into Gaza, withdrawal from the Netzarim corridor and other heavily populated areas, and a hostage exchange and negotiations for phase 2. So during phase 2, this is where Israel says it fell apart, even though it was them that went back on predetermined agreements about what phase 2 would look like. And I think something important to note is that like we definitely did also like receive political prisoners back, and that was a really important thing for Palestinians. So I don't want to be like, oh, the ceasefire was worthless, because it did give a small respite and also did get a bunch of prisoners released. Phase 2 was supposed to be a prisoner exchange, another one, and a permanent ceasefire. And phase 3, which obviously also never happened, was rebuilding and a body exchange. So the collapse in March wasn't just out of the blue. Israel had been consistently violating the deal by blocking aid. And to be clear, the goal of Israel has never been to just have a ceasefire. It's always been to ethnically cleanse Gaza and the West Bank, and then move into other areas in the region as part of its like greater Israel project. So time and time again, they've proven that they have no intention of engaging in negotiations in good faith, and they blame Hamas for the continued genocide, even though they never enter the negotiations from a place of wanting to end the genocide in Gaza. Furthermore, Netanyahu's political career and perhaps his freedom depends on the continuation of the war, because he's facing corruption charges in Israel that keep being put on hold by the genocide in Gaza. But like going back to Trump, he fully supported the breakdown of the deal and supported Israel's attack on Gaza that broke the ceasefire. And what basically ended up happening, right, is that a lot of hostages got released, which is what the Israeli civilian population, well, not really civilian, they're all in the IDF, citizen population was demanding, but at the same time, not an actual material end to the war, and did not let aid in. And Trump and his cabinet, since his first term, have talked pretty extensively about using Gaza as this like paradise, like seafront situation in the Middle East. So if you go to the next slide, I have a video that he posted on Truth. He truthed it, not tweeted it. If you play like 20 seconds of it, I think it gives the general vibe of what happened there. It's AI, by the way, obviously. It's nuts. It's like actually crazy.
Is that Elon Musk?
Yeah, it sure is. It's crazy, guys. Yeah, that's enough. I think we're good. Yeah, that's when he still liked Elon Musk. So that's a throwback. Yeah, that's when they were friends. There's like a scene of him, Netanyahu, and Musk like lounging on the beach. It's like actually crazy. Yeah, so there's that. You can go to the next slide. Okay. Yeah, I put that on there because it's so weird. I don't really have anything more to say about it, but like it's bizarre, and he truthed that too. So, yeah, moving on from that picture. If we look at like kind of the state of current negotiations, there's a lot of confusions. A deal was mediated in August, and Hamas said that they accepted it, all while Israel continued their ground invasion. The deal called for Israeli withdrawal from densely populated areas in Gaza, as well as a phased hostage release. But U.S. envoy Steve Witkoff and Netanyahu claimed that Hamas lied about accepting the deal and are just saying that to make Israel look bad, as if they needed more reasons to look bad. Then, while Qatar is helping to broker a deal, Israel and the U.S. bombed Doha, which is not helpful. And I'm sure Wyatt will talk more about that. So it's hard to know the exact state of these negotiations because Trump and Israel say things that are often really contradictory. And what we do know is that Israel wants Hamas to fully disarm, which will only lead to more massacres, like Sabra and Shatila, or like an escalation, if that's even possible, of like the current genocide. We also know that Trump is saying things that contradict with what both Israel and Hamas are saying. Like he claimed that Israel accepted a deal and Hamas was refusing it, while Hamas and Israel both said that they were looking over the deal and deciding. And while this is happening, Israel is escalating their ground invasion in Gaza and are showing very clearly that they're not interested in putting an end to the genocide. And so I think like what all this obfuscation and like weirdness is showing us is that not just that like Trump is saying things to like say things, but also to continue this confusion that we have and point fingers at Hamas, giving Israel more and more time to continue to escalate the genocide. Yeah, that's what I got.
Thank you. Our next speaker is going to be Wyatt Miller. Wyatt is a member of Freedom Road and is a leading cadre in our organization, particularly thinking about things in regard to the Middle East. He's also a member of the Minnesota Anti-War Committee. He had the opportunity to go to Syria several years ago, and we've asked Wyatt here today to talk about Trump's policies in the broader Middle East. And that's a lot because he keeps like literally expanding and allowing Israel to expand their agenda in terms of for the whole region. But we're excited to hear what Wyatt has to say. Please welcome him.
Thank you. Yeah, so I'm going to be reading off a script here because otherwise I could ramble on about this topic for far too long. Can we do the first slide, please? All right, so besides Palestine, since the Al-Aqsa flood operation of October 7th, 2023, Israel has bombed Yemen, Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and Qatar. These attacks reflected a sharpening of contradictions between U.S. imperialism and its regional targets, and those contradictions have decades-long histories, but I am just going to talk about the Trump administration's actions toward those countries this year. So in general, Trump's policy has been to leverage Israeli military aggression, as well as sometimes even US military aggression, or the threat of it, to achieve a maximalist set of objectives. These objectives aren't just limited to expanding Israel's occupation on its own terms, but also include longstanding US capitalist interests around exporting capital, extracting profits, and growing the US capitalist sphere of influence. In other words, US imperialism. Trump tries to portray his maximalist aggressive strategy as kind of a triumph of the will of his personal reactionary charisma. But ultimately, these are acts of desperation from the declining US imperialist camp. Acts of desperation are inherently unpredictable. Sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. In Yemen, it hasn't really worked, and we can go to the next slide. So after a year of Yemeni resistance, asserting control over the Red Sea and shutting down Israel's southern port, Trump ordered direct US airstrikes on Yemen, but basically ended up having to sue for peace after the US couldn't stop Yemeni forces from firing missiles at American warships. So despite the agreement the resistance made with the US, Yemeni resistance continues to shut down Israel's Red Sea shipping, including its southern port. Israel continues to bomb Yemen periodically, massacring civilians, and a few weeks ago it assassinated Yemen's prime minister. But in many ways, the imperialist camp has already played its hand in Yemen over many years with the years-long Saudi and Emirati ground invasion attempt from starting in 2015, which by 2022 had basically failed. Next slide, please. Yemen, led by the Ansar Allah resistance movement, which sometimes is called the Houthis, continues to stand up for self-determination for Yemen, as well as Palestine, as part of a broader pan-Arab and pan-Islamic solidarity. Next slide, please. So in Lebanon, Trump has used economic pressures and Israeli threats to force the Lebanese state to agree to disarm Hezbollah, which is a military group as well as a broad social movement that has done most of the resistance against Israel. Hezbollah has said it won't disarm, prompting concerns about civil war. Next slide, please. Trump's special envoy to the Levant, which is his fellow real estate billionaire Tom Barak, which I put some information about on the slide. He recently sparked mass protests across Lebanon last month after a press conference where he called Lebanese journalists, quote, animalistic and uncivilized. Those mass protests that sparked shows how even though the resistance may have been somewhat weakened militarily by Israel's attacks and the fall of neighboring Syria, which I'll mention in a minute, resistance in general is still strong in Lebanon. Next slide, please. The sharpening mask-off imperialist attacks threatened to backfire on the U.S. and Israel by driving a more united, multi-sect mass movement for Lebanese sovereignty, for which Hezbollah has demonstrated time and time again that it's the only real protector. Next slide, please. All right, so in Syria, last December, the Assad government was overthrown due to a combination of societal pressure stemming from U.S. economic sanctions and military support, which largely came from Turkey, which is a NATO member, of course, that it provided to Contra militias that were trying to overthrow Assad. So here, speaking as a member of Freedom Road, from the beginning, we had always opposed these imperialist-backed efforts to overthrow Syria, in general because we support Syrian self-determination, but specifically because President Assad had always refused to normalize with Israel and had maintained an independent anti-imperialist stance for the Syrian Arab Republic, while helping resistance groups, especially Hezbollah. Since Assad's overthrow, the new government has failed to resist further land grabs by the Israeli occupation. Next slide, please. The new government has met with top US and European officials and hinted at normalization agreements. It's disarmed Palestinian resistance groups in Syria and arrested their leaders. It's also massacred minorities by the thousands. Israel says the new government is still a threat and bombs Syria at every opportunity, while the US plays good cop, offering sweet deals to the new government. The Trump administration has also notably hinted that it will abandon the longstanding US proxy Kurdish militias if they don't integrate into the new centralized Syrian military. Next slide, please. In many ways, the situation in Syria is pretty bleak from an anti-imperialist perspective. And it's kind of a common misconception that people think that the war in Syria is over now. It's definitely not. There's still violence and open warfare happening across Syria, and the deep contradictions remain. The most optimistic thing I can say is that, speaking as a Marxist, we know that contradictions produce change. And so these contradictions will definitely produce new situations in Syria where new forms of resistance will no doubt arise. Next slide, please. All right, so in Iran, the outlook is a bit brighter. Israel's 12 days of attacks on Iran in June, joined eventually by US bombers bombing Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities, did little to slow Iran's bold, independent development path. If anything, the attacks may have helped consolidate the Islamic Republic. The real target for the US and Israel was never Iran's peaceful nuclear program, but its impressive, growing conventional ballistic missile program, which we can see it demonstrated in the slide. During the war, Iran retaliated against Israel's unprovoked aggression by demonstrating that it can accurately target individual buildings in places like Tel Aviv. That's not only distressing for Israel's military leaders, but also to the United States. Iran basically demonstrated that if it wanted to, it could probably hit US aircraft carriers stationed as far away as the Mediterranean Sea, which is like a really big development in military technology for an anti-imperialist movement. Over 12 days, the US and Israel failed to stop Iran from firing these missiles. Next slide. But the imperialist strategy was never to bring down Iran like by purely military means. And instead, the US and Israel have relied on internal divisions inside Iran and proxies inside Iran to bring down the government. And that's where this war really failed. Instead of fracturing under pressure, Iranian society united behind the Islamic Republic. For example, Reza Pahlavi's proclamation that he would restore the deposed Iranian monarchy fell completely flat. And that was in part a consequence of the unprovoked nature of the US-Israeli attack, but it also reflected Israel's declining position in the eyes of a world that has watched in horror as the genocide unfolded in Gaza. Next slide, please. So I just wanted to quickly mention Israel's bombing in Qatar earlier this month. This was an assassination attempt, as Nadiyah mentioned, against Hamas, the Hamas external leadership, which has been based in Qatar for a long time. And it took place during negotiating efforts to bring about a ceasefire in Gaza. That attack failed to kill its intended targets. It did kill a bunch of people. But it reflected an even bigger political failure for the US and Israel. Trying to murder the people you're negotiating with, it really isn't something you do when you have the upper hand in negotiations. And moreover, Qatar is supposed to be a close US ally and hosts important US military bases. But now Qatar and the other Gulf states that have traditionally acted as allies and even as proxies for US imperialism have seen that even those cozy relationships won't save them from increasingly desperate imperialist attacks. And that's the conclusion I'm trying to impart here. When we talk about US imperialism in decline, we're not necessarily talking about a decline in its military capabilities. In fact, it makes sense that we would see an increase in violent attacks in a desperate attempt to shore up US imperialism as its usual political and economic tools become less and less effective. And so I just want to conclude by saying here in the US, our job as internationalists is to raise the banner of solidarity with all nations oppressed by US imperialism and to insist on their right to resist that imperialism by whatever means necessary.
Thank you, Wyatt. I think we can agree Wyatt had a difficult challenge, right? Like, that was a lot of countries to cover in a short period of time, but Wyatt threaded that needle beautifully. Our next speaker is another member of Freedom Road and the Anti-War Committee, Andrew Josefchak. Did I pronounce that right? Okay. I just call him Andrew. Josefchak. Okay. I just call him Andrew. Sorry. So Andrew's going to be our next speaker. I think that now we're sort of getting into some areas where Freedom Road's line doesn't necessarily match up with with all the other red groups in town. And so Andrew's going to talk about our politics in terms of analyzing the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. And I think this is important to note because this is something that, like, Trump got elected on, like, this idea, and I think that Nadiyah did a great job of talking about how he pledged to be this anti-war candidate. I think we can agree that there's been a lot of war. But one of the places that he said that this anti-warness was going to come in is that he was going to have a peace deal on day one. You know, and obviously we're like a year in here and there's no peace deal. Andrew's been a part of helping craft our line nationally on the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. We're really excited to have Andrew here. Please welcome Andrew.
Thanks so much for the introduction, Meredith. You can go to the next slide. Trump's rhetoric around Ukraine, like Meredith gave a great introduction, he's claimed to be an anti-war candidate, and I think his rhetoric in general and the ways it does and doesn't line up with the actions he's actually taken since being reelected has been confusing to a lot of people, like all across the political spectrum, right? Right-wingers, liberals, socialists, whatever, people have had a lot of disagreement on what he's doing actually means. So the first thing that I really want to convey is that, in general, President Trump's policy towards Ukraine has essentially been a continuation of Biden and Obama administration policy. You can go to the next slide. So as Mayor just said, Trump said that he would end the war day one, right? And that he would do that by ending arms shipments to Ukraine, which is actually something that the Anti-War Committee has, demanded an end to this war, that U.S. arms shipments were fueling the war, expanding it rather than pushing it towards a state of negotiation. And the thing is, Trump, he actually did a couple times say he would, or actually did, end arms shipments, but it was only very briefly for a matter of a couple days. And it was only to extract concessions and resources from Ukraine. A few months ago, Trump strong-armed Ukraine into ceding, this is just obscene, 50% of all revenue from all future mineral sales to the United States. And yeah, Ukraine is a very mineral-rich country. Actually, like many targets of U.S. imperialism, it's been a very poor country with tremendous wealth underneath its ground, right? And if Ukraine did not agree to that deal, Trump suggested he'd stop sending the weapons, right? It's become a strong-arm negotiating policy. He also suggested at the time that the U.S. should completely seize control of Ukraine's oil and gas industry. And both of these have been presented as a kind of payback for U.S. weapons. The Ukraine would pay the U.S. back for support in this war by ceding its sovereignty over to the U.S. But the weapons do continue to flow. After the recent peace summit, so-called, in Alaska with Zelensky and Putin, Trump ordered much longer range missiles be sent to Ukraine than anything that the Biden administration ever allowed. So this will allow strikes from Ukraine way deeper into Russian territory than has happened before. I think like a year ago this would have been major news, but it's because it marks a serious escalation in this war, but it's been mostly passed over in silence. And none of this sounds anything like someone trying to end a war, right? You can go to the next slide. So the media reacted to, in particular, that mineral deal I mentioned, this sort of mafia-style dealing with a lot of shock, but it's not new. Under Biden, private U.S. corporations like Halliburton, which is an infamous war profiteer, entered into negotiations with Ukraine's state-owned, publicly owned oil companies to talk about privatization and takeover. BlackRock, which people may have heard of, another infamous company, the largest asset management firm in the world, it created a wealth fund to manage the reconstruction of Ukraine, which essentially means that after the war, U.S. firms would move in and Ukraine would be owned by these U.S. companies, that tremendous wealth would be extracted from the country in the rebuilding, and that the ownership of the country would basically end up in foreign hands, in U.S. hands. And under Obama, the crisis in Ukraine, which has kind of unfolded into the current war, was really precipitated by the Obama administration leveraging Ukraine's debt. It's a long story. I'm going to make it super brief. Basically demanded the privatization of industry, the elimination of state subsidies, of labor laws in Ukraine, the stripping of the social safety net in generally, to make life worse for working class Ukrainians and a lot better for U.S. businesses, big U.S. capitalists, right? This new government that was there's a new government was put in place by a coup, which occurred after Ukraine rejected the terms that the Obama administration was trying to impose. And that new government set itself on a course to join the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, which would essentially allow the U.S. to station troops and even nuclear weapons on Russia's border. Again, long story short, but this resulted in the secession of some region of eastern Ukraine. This became a civil war, and it kind of evolved towards war with Russia. Next slide. I can cover more of that in Q&A if people have more questions about it. For people who may have followed this war, a lot of what I've said maybe isn't super surprising and new, but one thing that I really want to draw people's attention to here is that none of this can really be, in my opinion, adequately explained without considering the legacy of the Soviet Union and of the defeat of the Soviet Union. The NATO bases that surround Russia today, those are artifacts of the Cold War, right? The fascist militias, which the post-coup government in Ukraine deployed to put down those secessionists in the east of the country, those are the modern face of an ultra-nationalist fascist movement that the U.S. has actually supported for decades in Ukraine throughout the Cold War to kind of create subversion within the country to take down, Soviet communism. And even the situation in Ukraine itself, the fact that the country even had a social safety net, that it had publicly owned industries and oil companies that tried to subsidize life for people in the country, those are leftovers, right, of the existence of the Soviet Union. And in 2014, actually, before the civil war began, Ukraine's gross domestic product was just beginning to approach the level that it had in 1991, before the country was plundered by a new capitalist class. That same plunder, moving on to Russia, that same plunder in the Russian Federation handed massive state industries over into private hands on a much greater scale than anything that happened in Ukraine or any of the other former Soviet republics. So basically, almost overnight, you had these newly minted capitalists holding monopoly positions in the Russian economy and even in the regional economy. And in Freedom Road, we are Marxist-Leninists. We uphold Lenin's position that monopoly capitalism and imperialism are essentially identical. Because when individual capitalist enterprises become so large and so powerful that they play a decisive role in the economic life of entire countries, competition between capitalists, which is the day-to-day existence of capitalism is competition, that competition takes the form of competition between states, which is war, right? And this is why in Freedom Road, I think relatively uniquely, we take Russia to be an emerging imperialist power. And I think this really explains, in many ways, some of Putin's negotiation with Trump in recent days. He's held a very hard line on Russian annexation of very valuable Ukrainian territory. He's also accepted the idea that the U.S. and other NATO countries could provide security guarantees for Ukraine following a war, but on the condition that Russia be one of those guarantors for security in Ukraine, which is essentially Russia saying it would like to be recognized at the big boys imperialist table, that it would like to be part of dividing up the spoils of this war, right? That's how we see things. Can you go to the next slide, please? But in conclusion, I want to say that although we see this as an inter-imperialist war fundamentally between the US and Russia, but we don't come out with slogans saying, victory to Russia, right? In the same way that we would say victory to the resistance at a Palestine protest. Not at all. And that's because we see it as an inter-imperialist war. So at the same time, though, do we think that U.S. imperialists are going to be more civilized or whatever in their conquest of Ukraine, and so we should support them? No, of course not, right? We don't carry water for these imperialists. So, and we can, I put up on the slide a bit, you have a whole laundry list of U.S. interventions you can look to for evidence that, many interventions the U.S. has claimed to be humanitarian have proved to be exactly the opposite. They've been absolutely repulsively violent, and involves just mass slaughter of people. So we see the U.S. as the most dangerous imperialist power in the world for this reason. And so it's very important to us that, and for working class people around the world, that the U.S. and NATO get their noses smashed in Ukraine, right? We want to see an end to imperialism worldwide, and the U.S. is the tip of the spear. So we demand U.S. out of Ukraine, sovereignty for Ukraine. The U.S. has no positive role to play there. And I think that's all I've got with my time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andrew. We also want to talk about the role that immigration plays. Immigration, weirdly enough, is both a domestic as well as a foreign policy issue, because really we're looking at the fact that U.S. economic policy and U.S. military policy is often the reason why, for example, people have to leave their homelands and come to the United States, but also the role that the U.S. military plays on the U.S.-Mexico border, and the role that the U.S. military plays in terms of threatening other people from coming into the United States, meant that we really wanted to have some of our friends from MIRAC on this panel. And so our next speaker is also a member of Freedom Road and a member of the Minnesota Immigrant Rights Action Committee. Please welcome Robyn Harbison.
Can you hear me? Okay. You can hear me? Okay. Okay. You could go to the next slide. I don't have as many pictures as all the other beautiful slides. So just kudos to all of my comrades here, because they've taught me. I started working at Women Against Military Madness 2 years ago, and I was coming not from 0 to 100, but pretty much 0 to 100 in that kind of space, and they have taught me a lot in their experience. So just like big kudos to them. I want to first talk about the big beautiful bill. It's kind of not in this slide. Is it on the next slide? Can you go to the next one? Okay, let's just do this one and then go back to it. In July, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act was enforced on July 4th, actually. It's notable to mention here and now because the scale of funding increase and like promotion and just like uplifting from the federal government to ICE was just gargantuan. There was figures all over when I was trying to narrow it down, and it's more than this billions of dollars, but just for enforcement and deportation operations, their increase of funding went $29.9 billion, higher than it was already. So just like having that as a foundation is just very intense. We have, of course, expanding detention centers. All of them are really goofy ass names. So I'm gonna read some of them off. Alligator Alcatraz, of course, became really notable over the summer, and I think it's still shutting down, planning to shut down. I think they're like maybe taking some people out or changing the numbers, but it's still very much there, and something to protest that locally is a target for Floridians. There's also Lone Star Lockup being built in Texas, and increase federal forces of FBI, all federal forces in cities to deal with crime in not a real way or anything. It's just fully to send people in to terrorize our communities. And the one for Chicago that is getting more light is called the Midway Blitz with ICE. So yeah, I was talking to my organizers in Mirac, and it's just how everything that is going on has to be spelled out. They're spelling it out for us essentially, and they're making jokes in our face without any shame anywhere, so we cannot have any shame in fighting against them. And just overall, the funding is more than multiple federal executive departments nationwide of police budgets in multiple states combined. It's more than militaries of other separate countries. So it's just a big emphasis on that. Learning to do immigrant rights organizing in the past year, I also learned a lot about how workplace raids in the 2000s that's why Obama was called the porter-in-chief. And that's still very much the norm of how they're gonna enact immigration policy. And one of the major ones recently was in Detroit at a Hyundai plant, and where Korean laborers were detained and taken while they were at work. There's also, in the past week, new contracts that ICE signed for increased use of AI for border surveillance, and the border is constantly occupied and surveilled by DHS and ICE. The last couple years, they put buoys in the water with razor blades over the river that's over the border where El Paso is. So as Marxist-Leninists, we are against any form of US intervention in these countries that bring our immigrants here, because they are sowing chaos, and no matter how many times they say it's for pro-democracy or pro-sovereign reasons, we know from history and from studying them that's never the truth, so we don't have a reason to believe the US. And the border is constantly occupied. This entire land is stolen land from Native Americans, and Freedom Road's also part of the belief of occupied nations within the prison house of nations we call the United States. The Southwest is considered Aztlán. So in tandem with indigenous Americans in the Southwest, a part of Mexico that was ceded to the United States in the Treaty of Guadalupe near the end of the 1800s, has always had Mexican people there. Mexican heritage people, and because of their political identity of being against, the U.S. immigration status in tandem with our imperialism policy, they are the people of the statement of we didn't cross the border crossed us, and that's why the land is called Aztlán. So we could talk about that during Q&A. If you want to go to the slide before. I think that has that. So this is more of what Meredith was talking about. I have some examples of just countries where all these literal examples are from. So I have Cuban heritage, and sanctions is the primary contradiction, the primary reason why life is so difficult in Cuba. Part of why some of my family is left and some of why my family has stayed, because some of them believe in the socialist project and continuing it on the island, and some people want to leave because it's just so much to have worried on top of daily life. Just restrictions of everything at the grocery store. And that's what Venezuela is going through as well. That's what Colombia is going through. We don't have as much time to talk about Venezuela, but they were There was an airstrike from the Trump administration just in the past week by fishermen. I think I'll go to 2 slides from here. Okay, so this is a bit about what Mirak is working on right now. Also some basic summary of like what we know about repression, studying like the people that have been detained. Mahmoud was released earlier this summer and was threatened again with deportation this week. And they literally said either Syria or Algeria. Like we have to keep in mind constantly that this is all like the same to like the imperialist mind, and they're not like, they don't care at all about us. So we need to be steadfast in our resistance, just like the Palestinians. I wanted to also uplift Malika Cordia because she's still in detainment since March of this year, and she is also Palestinian, but her case has not gotten a lot of attention. Isabella Lopez lives in Minneapolis as a community activist, an artist, a poet, and her charges are facing up to 8 years in prison for being at the ICE raid on Lake in Bloomington this past June. So we are fighting her charges. We're gonna promote a call-in on September 29th. So there's some of those details, and there'll also be a court appearance that day at 8 a.m. So we hope to see you there and can talk about more of this during Q&A. So thank you.
As Robyn said, we don't have a speaker talking specifically about how things have developed recently around Venezuela. If we would have known things were going to heat up in that way, we would have added a speaker. But as you can tell, we have a very long speakers list. So we decided to not add a speaker about Venezuela. Instead, I'm going to add this. Recently, the Trump administration has put Venezuela in its crosshairs again. Trump this time is using the charge of quote-unquote narco-terrorism to justify the deployment of warships, the attacking of Venezuelan ships, and the murder of Venezuelan fisher people. Similar to what Wyatt described as the U.S. policy towards Iran, the U.S. is targeting Venezuela to punish Maduro for standing up to U.S. imperialism. The U.S. uses sanctions, the funding of opposition groups, and coup attempts to try to destabilize Venezuela in a vain effort to overthrow the Bolivarian revolution. And FRSO, we stand with the Maduro administration and with the Chavez one before that in solidarity, and because we are excited that they are building socialism and transforming their society to one with equal access to things like food and housing, something that we think everybody deserves to have. And so we're going to go to our next speaker, but before we do that, I'm going to pass around. We have a sheet here from Freedom Road that if you would like further information about Freedom Road events, or if you would like further information about our general membership program, we'd be happy to contact you and let you know. We also have a table in the back. Yep, Drake is looking very smiley and friendly. Drake's like, come talk to me. And we have books, and we have T-shirts, and a variety of other things. So if you wanted to learn more about our organization, you could. Our next speaker is one of our general members, Nick Tolliver. Nick is a member of the Anti-War Committee and is going to be speaking about Trump's foreign policy to Africa. I think it's important to also recognize that Nick has been a leader in the Anti-War Committee, really expanding our ability to look outside of just Palestine and being able to look at the role that U.S. imperialism plays towards the continent of Africa. And so we wanted to give Nick that opportunity to be able to educate us more broadly. So please welcome Nick.
Thank you. So today I wanted to talk about Trump's destabilization and domination campaign in Africa, which is part of an ongoing U.S. imperial project in Africa. But first I wanted to shout out my political cartoon making skills, which have grown appreciably in the Anti-War Committee. Thank you, thank you. Can you go to the next slide, please? So in order to understand Trump's imperial domination and subjugation campaign in Africa, we have to go back to colonization. European powers, Western powers, have sought to dominate Africa since the 1400s. This has been a primary goal of imperialism. This has been how capitalism got started, was through the accumulation of wealth and the ill-gotten gains of the colonization of Africa and then of the Americas. And this is actually also how race was created, through the domination of Africa, through the enslavement of Africans and the sending of enslaved Africans to the New World. The category of blackness was created. And so the racism that we see today is a direct result of the colonization of Africa. The US's first imperial contact with Africa begins with the enslavement of millions of Africans and with the transatlantic slave trade. And the US has always profited from imperialism in Africa. Could you go to the next slide, please? So U.S. imperialism and neocolonialism truly begins after the Second World War in Africa, when the U.S. becomes a major global superpower. This is the Cold War phase of U.S. imperialism and neocolonialism in Africa. At this time, Africa is decolonizing. So nations that were dominated by European powers are gaining national independence, national liberation. Socialist and communist movements all across Africa are growing and developing. And the U.S. in its goal is to ensure that Western economic domination and the subjugation of Africa continues, and to ensure that despite national liberation, that African nations are economically subservient to Western powers and Western corporations. The U.S. supports puppet dictatorships all over Africa. It supports, props up capitalist leaders, killing communists, killing Pan-African leaders, and ensuring that the economic domination continues. The U.S. supports apartheid South Africa, apartheid Rhodesia, and horrible dictatorships like the dictatorship of Mobutu Sese Seko, who's standing there next to Reagan. While there are major setbacks in the U.S.'s Cold War in Africa, the U.S. largely wins the Cold War in Africa and uses its position to start the war on terror after the collapse of the Soviet Union. Could you go to the next slide? This is the second major wave of U.S. imperialism in Africa, which is the war on terror. In 2007, the U.S. establishes AFRICOM, U.S. Africa Command. This is an imperial force that sows destabilization and terror throughout Africa by engaging in what I like to call secret wars. These sort of mini conflicts, covert operations, drone strikes, targeted assassinations, and military and assistance and support to proxy forces, paramilitaries. So we actually don't have a list of all the countries that AFRICOM operates in. That is classified information. And we don't actually have a list of all the bases that AFRICOM has. AFRICOM has consistently denied requests for that sort of information. But the US claims to be fighting terrorism and promoting human rights. We all know what bullshit that is. U.S. military presence in Africa serves to ensure that labor exploitation and resource extraction continues unobstructed, that ensuring that the consequences and the contradictions, the inequality that is produced by extracting all this wealth from Africa does not stop that extraction. And so the U.S. has supported these sort of anti-terrorism campaigns, but they in turn produce more terrorism. In many ways, it's very similar to the war on drugs, where decades of fighting the war on drugs has only produced more drugs, more cartels, and the same thing in Africa, where the counterterrorism operations have produced more terrorism, more destabilization, and more need for U.S. forces. So it's a self-perpetuating cycle of destabilization and domination to support imperial resource extraction. Can you go to the next slide, please? The U.S. has developed an arsenal of tools of imperial domination in Africa and across the world. In particular, during the Cold War period, the U.S. really relied heavily on its soft power operations, including the development of USAID, World Bank and IMF loans, weapons deals, direct investment, but also Christian missionaries in the NGO industrial complex. It used these in addition to its hard power of overthrowing sort of Pan-African and socialist leaders to ensure U.S. domination in Africa. The U.S. also has hard power. The U.S. Does do regime change operations in Africa. It funds paramilitaries and terrorist groups. It engages in bombing campaigns and drone strikes. It does economic sabotage and sanctions. And it engages in destabilization and balkanization efforts. Can you go to the next slide? So Trump's approach to Africa has been what I would call fewer carrots and more sticks. The U.S. is essentially ending its soft power campaign in Africa, cutting billions of dollars in aid, cutting the USAID program, which, while it's a sort of a very nefarious and fucked up program, does provide a lot of material aid to Africans, a lot of food aid, a lot of medical assistance, a lot of education. There are estimates that as many as 14 million people will die by the year 2030 as a result of these cuts, and that food insecurity will get worse, and many disastrous things. And at the same time that Trump is cutting out U.S. soft power, he is doubling down on U.S. military power and hard power. In Somalia, he has already doubled the amount of drone strikes that we are conducting. He is continuing proxy wars across the Sahel region. He is engaging in weapons deals with militaries engaged in human rights abuses, and is continuing our counterterrorism operations. He's also, I don't have time to really get into it, but he's hit African nations particularly hard with tariffs due to their high trade imbalances. Can you go to the next slide, please? So I don't have time to get into every example, but I think one really important example to highlight is the U.S.'s imperial designs in the Congo. In the Congo right now, the U.S. is cashing in on decades-long imperial project of destabilization, basically bringing the Congo to its knees in order to extract the most amount of resources from them. The U.S. supports both sides in this conflict, but particularly supports Rwanda, who is actively destabilizing the eastern Congo and is legally extracting resources. Rwanda supports the M23. This is something you'll see all over Africa, of the double proxy, where the U.S. supports a proxy who has its own proxy, who's doing really fucked up things. So in the Congo, they are going for a peace deal. And in the peace deal, there is, and I gotta find the name of it, a regional economic integration framework, which allows the U.S. and U.S. corporations to extract cobalt, coltan, and re-enter the Congolese mining space. So this is part of its competition with China for resources in Africa. China has a lot of the mining interests in Africa, and this is the U.S. trying to remuscle its way in mafia style, saying basically, we will stop sicking our attack dog on you if you give us your minerals. And even if you don't stop, we're going to get the minerals regardless, because they're smuggling them through Rwanda. So the U.S. will, cash in either way. And the peace deal, we were sort of watching to see what would happen, is essentially fallen apart. The M23 continued to attack Congolese people. The war continues in the eastern Congo, but the deal still holds, and U.S. imperial interest will be seen through. If we could move now to Sudan. The U.S.'s imperial campaign in Sudan is really complex. This is another one of the double proxy situations. The U.S.'s sub-imperial allies in the Middle East are on both sides of this conflict. Sudan has been a target of U.S. imperialism since the dictatorship of Omar Bashir and his Islamist government. And the U.S. has sought to balkanize Sudan, to turn it into a bunch of little failed states instead of one, independent, powerful, relatively powerful African nation. The U.S. first balkanization campaign began with Sudan's civil war, which ended in 2011 with the secession of southern Sudan, in which U.S. proxy forces, including Uganda and Israel, aided South Sudan in its independence, creating a failed state in South Sudan, which almost immediately descended into civil war. The U.S., has this imperial design on Sudan and is working with the Sudanese military elite to foment another civil war. The United Arab Emirates, which is a close ally of the U.S., supports the RSF, or the Rapid Support Forces. This is a brutal, right-wing, racist paramilitary that has been credibly accused of genocide in the Darfur region. That sort of region of western Sudan. The RSF helps the UAE smuggle gold out of Sudan, and the U.S. gives the UAE the weapons that they need to advance this war. The U.S. also supports the other side. Turkey and Egypt support the Sudanese military, but this is a bleak war in which, regardless of the outcome, U.S. interest will be maintained. I wish I had a more hopeful note to end on, but this is probably my time, so thank you.
That's okay, Nick. That's why we're ending with China. So we're ending with not a bleak note. I set this arrangement up for a reason. So I do think it's important to recognize that in Freedom Road, we don't just talk about socialism in general as this sort of utopian thing. We actually defend socialism in our lifetime, and I think that that's something that's important and unique to us. And so our last speaker is going to be Sid Lovig. Sid is a member of Freedom Road Standing Committee and recently had the opportunity to go to China and has been actually doing a national speaking tour on China. And China, if you haven't noticed, is definitely the country that Trump likes to kick verbally, right? Blaming it for everything. And that was true of the first administration, and that's true of this administration, but definitely sort of promoting this anti-China hysteria is definitely a part of the Trump agenda. And I think it's important to recognize what Trump is trying to do, but also why Trump is trying to do it. And so here to talk to us about that is Sid. Please welcome Sid.
Okay, it'll be better. I can barely see everybody. I can see better from here. Okay, thank you. And then these slides, so I didn't make this. It's photos, but I didn't have time to make a slideshow, so I got one of my friends who was in China with me to put photos on it. So if the photos are messed up, that's why, okay? It's not me. Okay, go to the next one. Okay, yeah, that's good. Okay. So, the United States basically says that, countries can choose between being at the table or on the menu, right? But China's message at Victory Day, which was a military parade to honor China's role in the defeat of fascism in World War II, the message was different, and it was basically that the future is actually more peaceful, right? And that we have to create a, being led by China, that effort is being led by China. We have to create a global community for a shared future. And that justice and peace ultimately will win, right? So against that backdrop, go to the next one. Yeah. Against that backdrop, the Trump administration has been explicit that China is a central strategic adversary, economically, technologically, militarily. And so, policy is shaped accordingly. Trump's new cabinet is full of notorious anti-China hawks. And for a little bit of historical context, I guess this more correlates to the last slide, but it's all good. The United States has been trying to contain China since 1949, since the revolution, right? General MacArthur said Taiwan is the unsinkable aircraft carrier of the U.S. If folks don't know the history of the revolution, Spark Notes with that is that, after the communists with the masses of Chinese people defeated the nationalists with imperialists, the nationalists fled to Taiwan and made that their base, right? So I'll talk a little more about that later. But yeah, in 1950, they parked the 7th Fleet Navy in Taiwan to prevent Chinese reunification. 2011 basically marked in the Obama era, the pivot to Asia. And then there was the first Trump term, and there was a tariff war then. And then Biden had the semiconductor blockade. And now Trump's second coming, because he thinks he's Jesus. Some of his base thinks he's Jesus too. But with Marco Rubio and Peter Navarro openly planning for war, right? Marco Rubio said that the 21st century history books will be defined by China and the relationship between the United States and China. And that's true. So yeah, it's a straight line of escalation, and both sides are locked into a contradiction. And the United States says that China must be stopped. Okay, go to the next one. But unfortunately for them, it's just not working, right? China's rise, in a lot of ways, disrupts the whole imperialist system. By purchasing power parity, which is more accurate than GDP in this sense because they inflate the value of the dollar. China's already the world's largest economy, largest trading and manufacturing economy, biggest trading partner for 2/3 of the world. Over 150 countries have signed on to Belt and Road Initiative projects, which is basically an alternative to the exploitative practices of the World Bank and the IMF, right? Now, BRICS has been expanded to include Ethiopia, Egypt, and Iran, and BRICS represents 45% of the world's population and has already surpassed G7. So it's not working. Go to the next one. Yeah, the tariffs. The most beautiful word in the dictionary, more beautiful than love. Like, he literally said that. Isn't that crazy? He's wild. Okay. But yes, the Trump administration expanded and revived global tariffs. Scott Bessent said the goal is basically to persuade U.S. allies to participate in a grand encirclement of China, similar to the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? Trump wants to pull Japan, South Korea, and India towards Washington. And Trump's tariffs were meant to coerce China into accepting the U.S. trade terms. So they hoped that tariffs and sanctions would kneecap China, but it's really had an opposite effect because then China accelerates domestic capacity, right? China leads the world in renewable energy, in electric vehicles, telecoms, infrastructure, construction, advanced manufacturing. The solar capacity of China alone is greater than the rest of the world combined, and that's from 10 or 15 years ago, right? So the semiconductor war backfired too. And China's on the forefront of the new industrial revolution with AI, big data. We saw DeepSeek, and all those things showed that the U.S. no longer has an automatic monopoly on digital stuff, computers, phones. Okay, so then go to the next one. Yeah, so when economic sabotage doesn't work, then they want to beat war drums, right? Mao said political power grows out of the barrel of a gun. There's a record $1 trillion U.S. military budget. The U.S. has over 800 overseas military bases, 5,500 nuclear warheads, compared to China's 350. Unlike the U.S., China pledges no first use. And the U.S. is now rotating 5 aircraft carriers into the Pacific and building bases in the Philippines, encouraging Japanese rearmament. Australia, binding Australia into those things. Taiwan is the flashpoint, right? Okay, go to the next one. Yeah, Taiwan is the flashpoint. At one of these panel events, I said in the Q&A there was a question about Taiwan. I was like, well, Taiwan is part of China, and I didn't know that was going to be controversial amongst the left, but you'd be surprised, right? But yeah, Taiwan is the flashpoint. Biden pledged military intervention. Nancy Pelosi's stunt in 2022 in Taipei, that was the highest level U.S. visit in 25 years. And Pete Hegseth has reoriented the U.S. military to prioritize deterring China's seizure of Taiwan and shoring up homeland defense. So that was like a secret internal guidance that the Washington Post published of that. In 2023, the U.S. Air Force general circulated a memo predicting war with China by 2025. I'm like, what year? And like I said, Taiwan is the trigger. That's what Trump's new cabinet of hawks sees. And the aim is to do what? It's to dismantle Chinese socialism. A bit of background. I talked about the revolutionary history, but Taiwan has always been a part of Chinese history, linked through migration and trade and culture before it was seized by colonial powers. So separation began with colonization, right? Japan took Taiwan in 1895. I'll skip that stuff. And go to the next one. China's showing a different path, right? So 40 years, the People's Liberation Army has not dropped a single bomb. Their focus has been what? Lifting 850 million people out of poverty, a life expectancy that now overtakes the US. Forest coverage has doubled since the 1980s. 70% of the world's high-speed rail is in China, and high-speed rail is not profitable, by the way, so if that tells you something. In Iraq, they say, America bombs, China builds, right? And I'll close with this. Go to the next one. Yes, next one. Yeah, it's a simple choice. So that back to the Victory Day military parade, Xi Jinping said it. It's a simple choice, peace or war, right? So China is committed to being on the right side of history and not being intimidated by the bullies, right? That day was and that message was backed by 24 world leaders, mostly from Africa, Latin America, and Asia. I'll just close with a quote from Manuel Pinto de Costa. So he's the first president of Sao Tome and Principe. So this is it's an island country off the coast of West Africa. And he was recently in an interview about the Victory Day Parade. And he said, China's victory demonstrated to the world that when people yearn for freedom and liberation, no force can stand in their way. This victory convinced the African people that as long as the people stand united, the pursuit of independence and liberation is always possible. So, yeah, the future is bright. Yeah.
Thank you, Sydney. As we draw close to the end of our panel today, I think a normal question to ask is, what can we do here in the belly of the beast to end U.S. imperialism? As Andrew was talking about, to be direct, we can't end U.S. imperialism without ending capitalism. Lenin correctly calls out imperialism as the highest stage of capitalism. The U.S. tries to control other countries militarily because it wants to control them economically. Capitalism is not sustainable. It can only survive by stealing resources from other countries. In Freedom Road, we believe that the key is to building the people's movements to challenge and eventually change the U.S. government. We need a revolution. And to be honest, that's not going to happen from people reading Marx in people's basements. Okay? We need to build organizations like the Anti-War Committee, like Women Against Military Madness. I also see people here from MNAC, from the CJC, from MIRAC, from TCC for J. We've got a lot of the people's organizations represented here, USPCN. We've got a lot of people's organizations here, and the fact is that is what's going to cause change, right? We need to hold street protests. We need to challenge politicians, and we need to change public opinion. That is how we get real change. We need to use Marxism to guide our organizing and to navigate contradictions in real time so that we can grow and strengthen our movement. In these protests, we unite people to move them forward, and we use the mass line to make sure that we are winning all that can be won. We don't want to have slogans that are so watered down that they don't mean anything, like peace for Palestine. But we also don't want to have politics that are so left that we're only leading ourselves. Like if we're leading protests where we're just chanting death to Israel, that's going to push some people away that we might want to actually like recruit, right? To like be a part of this larger movement. We don't want to alienate the people that we're trying to educate. We need to push for the correct line, but we also need to realize when it will break our coalition. For example, in the early days of the Iraq Peace Action Coalition, our comrades played a key role in getting Palestine on the program of Iraq protests in 2003. We felt that was something that we could win, and we could do it without breaking the coalition, even though the coalition didn't have complete unity over it. And over time, we won the coalition over to that, and we used that as an opportunity to educate not only the people who were organizing in the Iraq Peace Action Coalition, but to organize the broader anti-war movement here in the Twin Cities about the importance of Palestine and U.S. foreign policy all over the Middle East. On the flip side, many members of the Palestinian community did not agree with our stance on the role of Assad and the axis of resistance, as Wyatt was explaining. And FRSO, we didn't water down our politics. Like, we have always stood by and defended the axis of resistance. But we also didn't insist that our position on Syria was the line for any of our local Palestinian coalition work locally, because that would have broken the coalition. And I think we can all agree that those coalitions have been essential for moving the people's movements forward for the last 3 years. And so it's important to use Marxism as a tool to understand how to lead people and not leave people behind, but also not to end up just leading yourselves. Currently, FRSO's position is that we must organize the biggest possible tent to unite as many people against the Trump agenda as possible. And this means uniting with liberals. This means uniting with Democrats. But it's important to note that uniting does not mean watering down our criticism of the Democratic Party. Through organizations like PACAT, the People's Action Coalition Against Trump, I just think the cute cat picture, like, you know, and then my brain is just happy thinking about cats. Through PACAT, we have gotten the opportunity to educate liberals in the Twin Cities, whether or not they're in groups or they're just people who are coming to these protests. But specifically, we've gotten to talk to a lot of people who would say that they have found a political home at places like 5051. And we've gotten to talk to them about the role that Walz has played as an opposition to our work to free Palestine. How he has literally a seat at the table to decide whether or not the state of Minnesota could divest, and he hasn't done jack, as well as that he's been in like an actual barrier door organizing. And these are the people that he needs to get elected for. I guess he's decided now to run for a third term, which I think we could all agree that he should go find something else to do. But he is running for a third term, but these are his base, and we're talking to them, okay? That's how we're gonna win. We were able to weave through these contradictions because we use Marxism-Leninism to guide our understanding of both the United Front and Mass Line. We also use the campaign method to focus our movement so we can exert real pressure and win tangible gains, as opposed to just randomly having protests at random locations with random slogans that have like no meaning. Through the campaign method, our supporters can also learn that Democratic City Council members, legislators, and State Board of Investment members are not the answer. That is not where power is located. That is not where solutions are. The politicians will not save us. They will only do the right thing if we make them, and not because they actually have a conscience or a soul. Lastly, as Freedom Road, we see organizing in mass groups as essential. There are other left organizations in the Twin Cities and nationally that want people to join their red group, and that's all they want them to do, join their group. Here's the deal. You cannot be a cadre-level member of Freedom Road Socialist Organization if you are not leading protests in the streets and if you are not organizing to build the people's movements, because we are not a discussion club. We are an organization of people who are fighting to change the world we live in for better. So if you are not a part of an organization fighting for social change, we urge you to join one, because that's what it's going to take. I had the pleasure of going to Palestine in 2002 and to going to Colombia 2 different times, including in 2006. And repeatedly, when we ask people, what can we do to help change what's going on here. Like people who are literally facing on a daily basis US imperialism. Every time I ask that question, they say, you got to change your own government. They're like, we got things under lockdown here, okay? We can fight our own battles. We don't need you guys to fight our battles. What we need you guys to do is to change your fucked up system. They're like, because the whole reason why our country is screwed up is because your country is screwed up. And so that is the task that we have as anti-imperialists. We have to change this country from the belly of the beast. And I've see so many exciting fighters in this room. You've already been doing that. We've got more work to do, but we are excited here at Freedom Road to keep building that with you. So thank you. So we are now at the exciting part of Q&A. So if there's something a speaker talked about, or if there's something that you'd like to know more about, I mean, we gave you a lot of information here. This is quite an in-depth panel. But we want to give you an opportunity now to be able to interact with the speakers. I'm going to keep a list up here, so if people could raise your hand if you would like to get called on, then I can create a stack. And then you don't have to just sit there with your hand up in perpetuity. But also that way I can make sure that we have different movements represented in questioning, as well as different gender identities and different racial groups represented. So raise your hand if you have a question for our panelists. And pretend you are not one of my students who is very quiet at these points. I love this. We've got questions. All right. Go for it. Other people want to raise your hands? All right. Cool. All right. We've got 3 to start off. We're going to start off with Lena. Go for it. Could people hear the question? Okay, so Lena's question in summary, and next time I'm going to walk around and give people the microphone. Thank you for letting me learn through this process. Is what can we talk to people who are saying free Palestine, free Ukraine? Like how can we use, for example, what's going on between Trump and Putin to talk to people? Okay, I'm so sorry if I paraphrased that poorly. I'm going to give the microphone to the next person after this. Go for it, Andrew.
Yeah, I think to some degree it's posturing. I wish. Thank you for asking this question, because it kind of touches, in my opinion, on something that Wyatt brought up in his speech that I would have liked to also touch on. Wyatt mentioned how in declining U.S. imperialism, I'm paraphrasing, but we increasingly see the U.S. kind of just unleashing chaos in various places around the world and trying to like bend the situation in a direction that can either be advantageous to the U.S. or at the very least disadvantageous to the U.S.'s competitors. I think that under Biden was very like we're behind Ukraine to the hilt. Victory, no matter how many Ukrainians have to die for it. I don't know that Trump does see things that way, and I think I mentioned that under Biden there was a BlackRock deal for like the reconstruction of Ukraine that would pilfer a lot of wealth. BlackRock actually relatively recently like canceled that reconstruction fund, and they said that it was because they'd kind of done their due diligence and laying out a roadmap. But I think that there's a possibility that the sort of monopoly capitalists in the U.S. have recognized, like, well, we're probably not going to win this war. We're just going to kind of, it's become a situation of unleashing chaos and doing what you can to profit off of it. And maybe we're going to pull back a little bit and just, not invest quite so much and try to, get more out of it without investing as much. If that kind of answers the general gist of your question, yeah.
Since I paraphrased your question so poorly, did you have anything you didn't get that you want?
Sure. I'll just tack on the last part. And do you think that there is an effective way to take what's happening, kind of turn it into a message for folks that still don't necessarily understand what the U.S.'s intents are with giving aid to Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I think if I was talking to someone who was arguing with me that way, if I was tabling or something on the street, just talking to an ordinary person who was well-meaning, you know, and had that kind of perspective, I would probably say, like, look, both of these people are representing the rich, you know, and this is a conflict that, you know, what's happening in Ukraine is absolutely tragic, and there's a lot of people trying to pilfer the country. And do I draw a super sharp distinction between Trump and Putin? I mean, to a degree, in that I live in the U.S. and I have a duty to oppose the foreign policy of the U.S. If I go out there and I say, oh, you know, Putin's just as bad as Trump, so we're going to say, you know, down with Russia. When you live in the U.S., going out on the street and holding a protest saying down with Russia is essentially a pro-war protest, if that kind of makes sense to people. That's the context in which it comes from. So I think I would try to, like, struggle with them from that angle, probably. Yeah.
All right, Brian, you are next.
All right, I got it. Yeah, I'm just wondering if anyone on the panel wants to talk a little bit more about, like, since we have, like, this larger picture, right, of, like, all the actions of the U.S. government and their interests abroad. There's often, like, this paralysis on, like, the left, especially if you're in diseased online spaces, of, like, the idea that the Americans are inherently see themselves in opposition to the rest of the world, right? That there is like this trend of, like, treatler shit, right? That, like, people are bought off to the extent that they, you know, see the Maduro government as presenting their accumulation of labubus or something like that. So I'm just wondering if you guys want to talk about, like, what you see as, like, the distinction between, like, the actions of the U.S. government and the way that what the actual interests of people here are, and what we need to take away from that in you know, working against the U.S.'s imperial ambitions.
Was that towards anyone in particular, or just towards the panel in general? Everybody. Okay. Who wants to take Brian's question? All right, pass the microphone to Nick.
I think it's always really important to highlight the ways in which imperialism doesn't benefit working class people here in America. I think that, like, the benefits of imperialism are very shallow and overstated, and, like, it's really important to highlight that to people because the oppression and subjugation that comes from imperial domination, while it primarily benefits the wealthy, like, actually materially like, depresses our quality of life. The money that we are spending on bombing children in Palestine or doing drone strikes in Somalia is money that we could be spending on the development here in America. We could have our own damn bullet trains. We could have our own healthcare infrastructure. We could have quality education. We could have so many things, and we don't choose to spend that money that way. We choose to spend that money enriching the wealthy and destroying developing countries. I think it's also really important to highlight that, like, you know, if you are black or a person of color, that, like, the imperialism that is happening abroad is advancing the racism that is happening here. Every wave of imperial war making breeds new forms of racism, breeds new extremism, brings the war back home. Those tactics of imperial domination that are you know, imported to other countries are brought back here. So a lot of the fucked up things that are happening will return in this imperial boomerang. That, like, those tactics, those surveillance techniques, that those forms of oppression that are developed on the imperial frontier are brought back to the center. And so I guess that's what I would say to people that are invested in that view of U.S. domination.
So Wyatt wants to go next.
Yeah, and just building off what Nick said, in Freedom Road, we hold that the Black Belt South, as well as Aztlan in the Southwest, like Robyn touched on, we hold that these are actually oppressed nations inside the United States. So, you know, to give a really extreme example that, you know, is starting up under Trump, you know, Trump sent the National Guard into Washington, D.C. D.C. historically is part of the Black Belt South. It's a black majority city. And there have been conservative commentators like Benny Johnson, who's like pretty famous, and he just like straight up said he's out there advocating for complete depopulation and bulldozing of entire neighborhoods of Washington, D.C. And it's just like so clear that, you know, he's talking about giving the black neighborhoods in Washington the Gaza treatment. So, you know, like we're rapidly approaching potentially a situation where it is coming home like in a really big, really blatant way where there, you know, it's not really a distinction between imperialism outside the U.S. and imperialism inside the U.S.
I just have like a 2-second thing to add because I've been thinking about it. Like it was Malcolm X that said that eventually the devil's chickens will come home to roost. And I like that one, so I just was gonna put that out there.
Also, just really briefly, I do think that Trump's success running as a supposed anti-war candidate, I think does tell you that there is like an instinctive or kind of underdeveloped impulse within a lot of the U.S. that war is bad for people in the U.S. I'm always surprised. I work with like a lot of Trump guys, like my coworkers. I'm always surprised by how well educated they are about the war in Ukraine in particular, because it was such a like, you know, campaign promise, end this war, and they would you know rant to me at the break table about how we got to get out of these wars and stuff. Of course, as multiple speakers highlighted, Trump has not followed through on this, but I want to say I think part of our task is Trump's rhetoric that he has not followed through on has been one of like right-wing isolationism, right? In Freedom Road, we're not isolationists, we're internationalists, right? We recognize that it's exactly the opposite. We recognize that power to working people around the world benefits people, working people everywhere, right? And so we have a duty to combat within this kind of like nascent anti-war impulse within a lot of people in the US that, to take Ukraine as an example, things suck here because we're sending all the money to Ukraine. It's not just that. That's part of it. Like Nick said, that we invest, you know, $1 trillion a year in the U.S. military budget that could be spent here. It's also that destroying these movements for peace and justice around the world directly damages us. So, yeah.
Thank you. All right, Drake, you are next. I don't know how far my microphone goes, so you might have to meet me.
So throughout the presentation, there were just so many good and informative slides, and I saw people, because I was in the back, I saw people taking pictures of the slides and stuff. So I was wondering if there's any way we could make those available or put them on FRSO-TC Instagram or something. People can see them later. Yes or no question, I guess.
Is anybody opposed to that? Yes.
Hi. So sorry if you already talked about this. I went and got a snack and came back. So could you talk more about U.S. soft power and imperialism, soft imperialism, and how like the U.S. peddles humanitarian as a means to like, despite its like contradictory commitment to like U.S. military and imperialism? I'm currently getting my master's degree, and it's just like really disturbing. Like we just had a guy from USAID who was the director of the West Bank and Gaza initiative come and talk about like humanitarianism. So could you talk more about how it's like packaged as that, but also the like, yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. So I think like a really, really clear example is like the GHF in Gaza, like using, I think like this happens all over, but this is a really like visual example of like using food as bait for Palestinians. But then like I think while folks were talking, I was thinking about like the pink tide in neoliberalism, in Latin America, and how like IMF funds, which inherently would come like with the ability to like feed ourselves or like feed themselves, were like predicated on U.S. takeover essentially of these governments in Latin America, and how like food, even if it is helpful in the moment, what ends up happening is like what can be given can also be taken away. And the second you accept like an ounce from the U.S., they use it as like leverage to make you do like whatever they want. And if you don't, then you go hungry.
I agree with that, and I just will add that with USAID, a lot of how soft power works through that is, in a lot of countries where it's the imperialist attack might not be as sharp, but the reason the State Department, historically at least, set up all of these programs was, they're quite smart ultimately. Like it's not just about putting a gun to people's head and saying do what the U.S. wants. It's a way for the U.S. to send all these well-meaning people into those countries and essentially use them as agents, knowingly or not, to build person-to-person relationships with civil society groups inside those countries, and then use those relationships kind of as needed over potentially a long period of time to help build, in the event the U.S. decides to really go after that country's government, they've built this network to essentially create a fifth column in those countries that it can be, to drive a wedge and whether that means basically, ultimately to destabilize these countries. They can incite mass protests and then create provocations to really inflame the situation. We see that in a lot of different countries. That's kind of how the coup in Ukraine started in 2014. That's happened in Venezuela multiple times. The U.S. tried to use that against Nicaragua in recent years. Unfortunately, really failed. But so I think it's just important to understand that, there are lots of well-meaning college students who get sucked into the State Department to go, do good around the world. And maybe they are doing sort of on its face, a good thing, USAID, there's been a lot of publicity about how they delivered HIV treatments to countries in Africa. But those deliveries come at the expense of having these U.S. Networks go into those countries for nefarious purposes and building a long-term network that it can use against those countries.
Well, the microphone's going to Nick. Go ahead. I just wanted to add, I saw firsthand what Wyatt was talking about when I studied abroad in El Salvador and Nicaragua, and I would add that the Peace Corps is also used in that same way, and it's definitely used as if you are siding with the U.S., you will get this U.S. assistance for your village. And if you are not working with the United States, your village will not get this type of support. So it's definitely used as a carrot, but similar to what Nick was talking about in terms of a carrot versus stick approach.
I wanted to add to this because this has been particularly pernicious in Africa, but obviously all over the world, that one of the things that the U.S. does in terms of its aid imperialism is it will give, millions or hundreds of thousands of dollars while extracting billions. And so, we talk a lot about mutual aid, and there is nothing mutual about the aid that the U.S. imperialists give. It always comes with neoliberal strings. It always comes with demands on how that money is spent, on who that money is given to, on how it is used to enrich, local corrupt networks. And so I think this is something that's always really important to talk about with U.S. aid, is that it is never conditionless, and it is always used to the advantage of empire, and it is profitable. That it is This is part of a profitable campaign. I think the other thing to highlight is that we have shifted away from soft power in Africa, in part because of the collapse of the USSR. That when there was a viable communist alternative that was, invested in fighting for liberation across the world, the U.S. was a lot more invested in these sort of soft power projects. And the U.S. has shifted to hard power as its monopoly status has solidified, and it has increased its violence.
Okay. Erica is next.
First of all, holy shit, I learned so much today. You guys, I'm gonna put you in a bus and bring you to my family Christmas and just take you everywhere. This presentation was amazing. Huge props to all of the research that went behind it. Thank you so very much. I had a thought before I have a question, because I just wanted to kind of think about after hearing immigration and then Africa, I wanted to also point out how Africa is being abused and punished and also exploited in terms of these third country deportation agreements. Basically a bunch of African nations are now being bullied into accepting deportees from anywhere around the world. And that's definitely part and parcel to our increased deportations here and our bullying of African nations. The fact that I think at last count that I remember, at least 36 African countries have some sort of travel ban or complete visa restrictions imposed on them. So those things play really importantly together. So I wanted to kind of say that. And then also I wanted to address to anyone in the panel can answer this, but we talk a lot about the rise of white supremacy kind of in our movements, and actually pointing out to that itself, Trump has told white South Africans, you'll get automatic asylum if you come here, right? And we see that in the immigration raids, the massed terrorist kidnappings of people in the backs of trucks that jump out. That's a Proud Boy tactic. The Proud Boys have been using that shit for decades, right? The firing of anyone, or even in the army, who criticize Charlie Kirk as a person, right? Or the making sure anyone who can't shave their beard gets relieved of their duties in the army. It's 60% of black people, right? It's consolidating white supremacists with guns, right? And taking out anyone that might reject that. And I want to know kind of how Freedom Road, cool organization, I should really learn more about it. But I want to know how Freedom Road really wants us to touch on that topic of white supremacy and how kind of that links our movements, especially talking about the increase in militarization. Well, we're talking about that abroad, but obviously people touched on it here. The occupation in the National Guard, DC, LA, Memphis, Chicago's next. Minneapolis, I'm sure, is coming at some point. But how do we, what's the best way to fight back about that? Thank you for Robyn for saying we should have no shame in our fighting back. But we get a lot of criticism from other liberals in the movement about sorry, I'm going on about our tactics, and so what are your thoughts on tactics and fighting about blatant militarism and white supremacy against our movements here? That was a long question.
All right, who wants to take that one? All right, let's pass the microphone to our friend Wyatt.
Well, we want people to stand up and fight back. I say that, and I just realized that Tim Walz just stole that slogan from us yesterday. But
no, he didn't. We're not giving it to him.
All right. Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't back down. We shouldn't hide. We need to take on these threats head on, and the way we do that is by building mass movement and taking to the streets and shutting shit down. We saw in Chicago that it works. And Freedom Road was part of that. But people who have been working in mass organizations in Chicago for years, united to form a big coalition. And they showed that they were ready to shut it down if the National Guard rolled in. And it, at least for now, Trump has backed off, and now he's looking at Memphis. So, I mean, I can pass this off, but fighting back works. Dare to struggle, dare to win.
When I say dare to struggle, you say dare to win, okay? Dare to struggle! Dare to struggle! So thank you for asking, Erica, because it's just something I've been thinking about a lot in just like news and everything, and something I had to rush a little bit in part of my, like, the political repression of activists overall, is because that's tied to being an immigrant, being Palestinian American, being just Arab American, being an immigrant or looking like an immigrant. It like increases, essentially you always have a risk of protesting for Palestine. So I'm like, okay, bet I'll do it like 3 times and like whatever. Like I don't care about arrest, right? But if you have the obvious privilege or non-privilege of being a citizen or not, then you're like your rate of being politically repressed like goes very high. And our protest yesterday with Mirak was specifically about racial profiling essentially being legalized in LA. It's like they just said it's okay if ICE does it. It's literally like, oh, I don't know, ask your mom. Like it's just like I think it makes the United Front task almost easier, because my main way of seeing through it is like constantly saying this is white supremacy over and over, because that activates all of us. It makes like white people angry because it's not all of us, right? Hey, not all men. So it's like if they're just making their job be like, we're like consolidating all the alt-right tactics essentially into ICE and giving them the most money in the whole world. And I'm like, that is really obvious, like how bad you are. So I think it's just emphasizing the United Front and how we have to be united in that and constantly call out what white supremacy is, what fascism actually is defined, and our understanding things are changing every day, so we just had to be realistic about that, and tell like our stories of how our families are here and how their lives were impacted. It's not fully related, but partially, just like thinking a lot about like the personal political thing. I had so many speaking engagements this week and was like, let's not get into the personal stuff because it doesn't matter. Like, who cares? No one cares. And we're talking about material reality of like our conditions and how we're like, we have to respond to them because it's literally what's happening to us. And I couldn't stop thinking about, we also uplifted Silverio Villegas Gonzalez. He was murdered by ICE in Chicago last week over a traffic stop. And he lives, I don't know where he was from in Chicago, but where he was murdered is extremely close to where my immigrant family lives. And I just was like, there's no like way to say that on the mic right now. And it's like, but this is just what it is. And we just have to keep saying white supremacy, white supremacy. And that's why, why your points were also really tied the like white savior thing of like, we have this soft power that we're used to, and this like, I keep forgetting what it's called, the basis of just like how we act. What is it called? Foundation. Yeah, like foundation of white supremacy in the United States. Like we all know it, and saying it didn't like stop George Floyd from being murdered or anything. So we addressed that through material wins we could have with community control of the police, people petitioning like right after this, and etc. So I'll just leave it there.
If I could add one thing to this, I would just say that solidarity is at the core of our collective liberation. That like we can't do it alone, we can't do it in isolation. Like we have to be in solidarity with each other because our oppressions are intersecting. Our solidarity must be absolute, and so I see so many different groups here, and that brings me so much joy because it is together that we will win this.
100%. We've got 2 last questions, and then I want to invite people to some upcoming events.
All right, my question is about Palestine. I know we've talked a lot about the optimism like in China and other movements against imperialism, and we've been seeing this active, like horrific stage of imperialism being played out in Gaza. Do you see it as optimistic? I guess this is for Nadiyah. Do you see it as optimistic outlook for Palestine as well?
I mean, yeah, because 2 years into like a brutal genocide, Hamas is still blowing up tanks. Like Israel is being backed by trillions of dollars in military money in the form of the US, and guys in like flip-flops are still like kicking the shit out of them, you know? So yeah, I mean, I guess like, and then we also see Yemen and Iran and like all of these other like axis of resistance powers also fighting back, and like China being in the position that it is, like globally the system is changing, and I think like Palestine isn't separate from that. And I think like as long as people like on the ground in Gaza are like still fighting and on the West Bank are still fighting, then there's optimism to be had.
Anyone else? Okay, all I want to say to add on to that question is that when I started doing Palestine Solidarity organizing in 2001, like there was no space to be able to talk about Palestine and not be called an anti-Semite like every 5 seconds, okay? Like I just feel like the political culture in this country has changed dramatically, and like that ain't going back in the box, okay? That is out there, that has changed. Like my students on a daily basis are talking about Palestine. My students on a daily basis are talking about what are the real consequences of US imperialism. My students on a daily basis understand that Israel is the one who is funding all of this, and so like there's, as much as the right wing would like it to, we're not going backwards. Okay, like we're not going backwards. Like so, it the sea change has happened, and so like I just think that has been pretty transformational and pretty exciting to watch in my lifetime. Like there have been very few times in my lifetime where I've seen that much of a change in terms of public opinion in any topic other than gay people. I guess. Not everybody likes us now again, but for a while we were looking pretty good. But like there's been a big sea change on the Palestine question, which I just think is really super beautiful, and good luck on that one, bad people, because that's not changing. All right, Michael's got our last question.
Thank you, panelists, for your time today. These presentations were excellent. My question is, earlier this month, there was a leak of a report that the Pentagon is supposedly changing their national strategy, pivoting away from Beijing, pivoting away from Moscow, and focusing more on what they call the home front, which includes South America, based on this report. What do you make of that in the context of a declining U.S. empire, and do you see this as something that is actually, plausible, or just like kind of another red herring?
I can take a stab at it first, and then you want to jump in. I think what's interesting is that, since the Monroe Doctrine, right, the United States has really seen Latin America as its backyard as opposed to a place that people just happen to live and be living their own lives, independent of the U.S.'s vision for them. But the fact is that, like, the United States has lost control of its backyard, okay? Like, there are so many examples of countries that are doing their own thing independent of what the U.S. wants for them. And Venezuela is really leading that sort of like opposition. Both Venezuela and Cuba are sort of leading that, you know, that train of like, hey, there's another way is possible. Like, you don't have to do what the U.S. wants. And so it is, like, as people are talking about this is a declining empire. And so, like, it's hard to go after China if you can't, for example, keep your own neighborhood like doing what you wanted to do. Also, I think that I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. really wanted to see if it could get a win. You know, like, it doesn't get wins. Like, we lost in Afghanistan, we lost in Iraq. Like, we've been losing like nobody's business since the war in Korea. And so, like, there's no place that the U.S. can go to and be like, look, we came in and kicked some ass, and now everyone's doing what the U.S. wants us to do, like wants them to do. And so, you know, there is that to some degree, but I also have read a lot of people saying that there is not political will in this country to go do a land invasion in a place like Venezuela, and like the United States would get its ass kicked in Venezuela as well. And so I don't feel like I have a good understanding because these events have happened so rapidly in the past 3 weeks. So I feel like I don't want to speak out of my ass, but I do feel like part of it is an example of how the U.S. is not able to sort of have its own backyard, what it perceives. I don't obviously think of Latin America as our backyard. But what it perceives is area that's supposed to be under our quote-unquote direct control, and it's definitely not. But also, the U.S. has been talking for quite some time about wanting to pivot to Asia, but since the U.S. can't win any of the things it's trying to do in the Middle East, it hasn't been able to make that pivot to Asia. And so, I mean, part of it is that the U.S. has a plan for how it wants to have imperial control over the world, but its plan isn't going very well because, as a matter of fact, the U.S. is a declining empire, not one that's ascending.
I really agree with what Meredith just said, and the only thing I'll add is I'm not familiar with this leaked report, but the only thing I'll add to that is I think still behind that, even if it's like, well, we explicitly want to pivot to Latin America, I still think behind that lurks a confrontation with China, if that makes sense. Like, it's still a, and we've been seeing emerge over the past decade, a new Cold War with China, just like the Cold War, which was the principal enemy of the U.S. during the first Cold War, was the Soviet Union. It wasn't just fought as like a direct military confrontation between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It involved proxy conflicts and economic conflicts all over the world, right? So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if Meredith said, if the U.S. would like to shore up its control closer to its own borders, but at the same time, I still think China remains the big enemy for the U.S. because it is a socialist superpower that is presenting an alternative to capitalism, right?
I just want to add, because it hasn't really come up yet, but one of the countries that may be targeted by that new sort of doctrine is Mexico. Because you're talking about the report where they said, the Pentagon was like, if we're targeting anything that we call cartels, we decided that we will be able to intervene regardless of national borders, right? Is that sort of the thing you're talking about?
I'm not sure if they talked about that. We might be talking about different things.
Okay, well, I'll just mention it anyway. They did put out the Pentagon put out a statement that said that they're willing to, disregard national sovereignty to go after cartels, quote unquote. They've already made clear that they consider the Venezuelan government to be a cartel without any evidence for that. They just kind of made that up as a way to go after Venezuela. But I do think, Mexico is in the crosshairs as well. I mean, Mexico historically has always been in U.S. imperialist crosshairs, and they've had their all sorts of kind of covert ways to operate there. But the Mexican government under Claudia Sheinbaum has been one of the last lifelines of support alongside Venezuela and Nicaragua for Cuba, for instance. And so I wouldn't be surprised if Trump tries to use all of this racist narrative that he's been building up against Mexican immigrants, and these allegations of drug smuggling and fentanyl or whatever he's always going on about, as a way to try to weaken the Mexican government itself.
So I know you guys are all smarter than this, so I'm still gonna say it, even though it's common sense. So actually, I'll tie it into another advice thing. And this is the last question anyway, right? Okay. This is probably driving advice you've gotten too. I got it from my mom, and she was like, just assume everyone is extremely stupid on the road, and so you could apprehend anything. And you kind of have to do that for this too. Just even though it's very common sense to not believe the drug smuggling and cartel, it's not saying it's not a problem at all in human history. It's just that it's not the excuse you can use for everything. So I think we just have to, when people are talking about oh yeah, Mexico and Venezuela has a lot of drug smuggling, they don't. I know Mexico does, but Venezuela is not the big port and all of this. So we just have to interrupt it when people are I have something to say about we have to interrupt freaks.
So as Marxists, our first question is, why is the U.S. interested in that location? And the answer is never the one that you're being told by the Pentagon. But that's important for us to do, is to do your own research. You can understand what are the U.S.'s economic reasons for that intervention.
I think if I could just add, I actually think the Pentagon is full of shit. I think that they're lying. And certainly in Africa, I mean, they have demonstrated with their actions. I mean, I don't take people at their word, especially professional liars who, refuse to audit, that their actions indicate that they are not pivoting, that they are not leaving in Africa, that if anything, that they are actively trying to obfuscate how deeply they are involved, that they are actively hiding. That's why I like to talk about what's going on in Africa as secret wars, because the U.S. is actively hiding the extent to its imperial involvement in Africa. And I think that is the case, all over, that we should really focus on the material conditions and on what these imperialists actually do, as opposed to just what they say, and seeing if what they say is in alignment with what they actually do.
Yeah, I just have a really quick thing. I think it was J.D. Vance. He tweeted something about narco-terrorism, and I was just thinking about the language of terrorism now being used just against anyone that we don't like, I guess. And thinking about how an internationalist perspective is really useful in those situations, because some guys in a fishing boat aren't narco-terrorists. I don't even know what that's supposed to mean. But I think the U.S. has learned in the post 9/11 years that if you call somebody a terrorist, you can kill them. And so really thinking globally, and I think this also connects to our secret wars in Africa and the language of terrorism that we use globally.
Can we please give a round of applause for our panelists? Again, this was a hard task to go across the globe and sort of talk about Trump's foreign policy and to do it from a Marxist perspective. And obviously we did not have the ability in the 2 hours of this event to cover the entire world in every location. But I think that you got a smattering of these types of what our position is. I want to remind people that we have a table in the back. So if you would like to talk more about Freedom Road, we have people who are excited to talk to you about that, as well as other materials. And if you recall from my speech, I said the most important thing to do is to be in the streets, right? So I'm going to tell you 2 opportunities to be in the streets in the next couple of weeks.